Good afternoon. My name is David Isiama. I am the Research and Content Development Manager here at the Black Wealth Data Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to what we hope will be an insightful, energizing, and catalyzing conversation exploring the intersection between what has been called the Great Wealth Transfer and its implications on homeownership, entrepreneurship for Black individuals in the United States. Before we get started with today's discussion, I want to share a little bit about the Black Wealth Data Center and what we do. We are founded and funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies Greenwood Initiative to provide data to public and private sector leaders to affect wealth equity in the United States. We provide one of the most comprehensive interactive databases for racial wealth equity, with data offered at the local, regional, and national levels. If you're looking to diagnose the cause of racial wealth inequities or map the impact of certain policies and investments, our tools can help you do just that. With a free user account on our platform, you can access all of our available data and tools, including 23 data sets across core topics like homeownership, education, business entrepreneurship, and assets and debt, and as well as 57 downloadable data visualizations with more to come. Next, I would love to introduce our esteemed panelists. In order of appearance, Dara Eskridge is an urban planner, architect, and philanthropic leader dedicated to building wealth and power in marginalized neighborhoods through equitable development. She serves as the CEO of Invest STL and holds various advisory roles, including with the St. Louis Federal Reserve and Bloomberg Philanthropies Greenwood Initiative Black Wealth Data Center. Eskridge earned degrees in architecture and urban planning from Tuskegee University and Columbia University, respectively. Michael Neal is a senior fellow in the Housing Finance Policy Center at the Urban Institute. He is a seasoned housing economist with a background at Fannie Mae and the National Association of Home Builders. At the Urban Institute, Neal's research has focused on racial equity and wealth building, with a specific focus on homeownership. Neal holds degrees from Morehouse College, my own alma mater, and the University of Pennsylvania, and serves on several advisory boards. He has also provided expert analysis to major print and television news outlets. Last and not least, Ashon Nesbitt is CEO of the Florida Housing Coalition, a leader in community and nonprofit sectors with expertise in urban planning and real estate. He has advanced community land trust and housing affordability initiatives. Nesbitt holds 2 master's degrees from the University of Florida and a bachelor's from Florida A&M University. With that, I want to hand it over to Michael Neal, the primary author of the latest Urban Institute research on intergenerational wealth transfers powered by the Black Wealth Data Center. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, David. Again, my name is Michael Neal. I'm a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute located in Washington, D.C. Just for a little background, the Urban Institute founded in the 1970s, really around, kind of as the name indicates, the challenges that urban areas face. Obviously, this was a key part of, a lot of the economic and the political environment that really prevailed at that point. And so that, led to a lot of work related to housing, related to entrepreneurship, related to broader wealth building, as well as thinking about the built environment, and specifically focusing on communities of color and other groups that have historically been marginalized. And so as you hear this research, it really kind of comes out of the heritage of the Urban Institute, but also meeting the demands of today. Certainly, the Great Wealth Transfer is a topic that has received a lot of attention, particularly across the financial industry. It reflects, in part, the fact that senior generations do hold a sizable amount of wealth that ultimately they may pass down. Certainly things like medical expenses, any other type of philanthropic interests or strategies may ultimately impact how much is transferred. But at the end of the day, there is, I think, a consensus expectation that a vast amount of wealth will be passed from senior generations to younger generations. But again, going back to thinking about what are the implications for communities of color, and in particular for Black communities, it starts, I think, with some level setting and some evidence around who holds the wealth and who doesn't. And this chart makes quite clear that a larger proportion of the wealth held by senior generations, in this case, those that are in the baby boomer generation, as defined by Pew Research and older, do own a sizable portion of that wealth, especially when we compare it to the wealth held by all senior Black families. And that's both overall as well as housing wealth. And that housing wealth is particularly important because it not only reflects home ownership, but it also reflects the housing equity that has been built up either through higher house prices or the ability to pay down any mortgage debt. But at the end of the day, it's clear that when we think about what will be transferred, a larger proportion of wealth is held by senior white families. But the other side is around expectations among younger families. And, this chart, I think, shows clearly, two important dimensions. The first one is certainly race, that younger white families are more likely to expect to receive an inheritance. In this case, the way the data shows it is a sizable inheritance. Well, certainly, we may lose a little bit in terms of smaller intergenerational transfers. But that being said, clearly, white families more likely to say that they expect to receive an inheritance. But also, not only are Black families less likely to receive them, but Black renter families are the least likely to expect to receive an inheritance. So when we start to think about what are the implications for the Black-white homeownership rate gap, which stands at levels near kind of where they were before passage of even the Fair Housing Act, we see that exactly the families that we would want to ultimately move from renting to homeownership are the families least likely to expect to receive an inheritance. But at the same time, the other side of the coin, so to speak, is also the amount that they would expect to receive. And if you read the report, you'll see that we try to illustrate how the degree to which expectations are matching reality. And in a lot of ways, they are broadly similar, giving us confidence to kind of talk about these results. And what you see here again is differences by race, that Black families, those that expect to receive an inheritance, the amount that they expect to receive is less. And in particular, a lower expectation among Black renter families. Now, obviously, this is going to exclude a lot of other issues that are taking place, but it does suggest that the great wealth transfer, in terms of its implications for closing the Black-white homeownership rate gap, may actually have the opposite effect. In part because much of the wealth is held by senior white families, in part because Black families and Black renter families are not only less likely to expect to receive an inheritance, but if they do, their expectations of what they will receive are lower as well. And so that, I think, should motivate and has the potential to amplify some of the disparities that we talk about with respect to home ownership. If I were to end, I would probably point out that, it also is a call to action around a lot of the policies that government can take, but also that nonprofits and industry are taking to actually address them. This is exactly the kind of trend that should continue to motivate that kind of important activity to address those racial homeownership disparities. David, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. I would say that, in my maybe second or third reading of the article or the report, one of the things that came to mind was an engagement that we have with the city of New Orleans, where they're looking to try to convert people who live in geographies that are that experience high rent burden into homeowners. And my initial, as we've been having these conversations, one of the things that came up was like, well, it's good and great to get people into homes. But, if you've been around, if you remember Hurricane Katrina, chances are, and also actually based on the data, most of the folks who live in low-lying areas are the ones who are rent burdened. So if you put them in a home that they can't protect the asset off, then you essentially end up sort of exacerbating the problem. And then the other thought also came around this idea that a lot of insurance companies are moving out of the home insurance business, especially in highly socially vulnerable areas. And thinking about the compounding effect that, when people are looking to start a business, that, one of the biggest assets that they can potentially leverage for that loan is a property. So that's kind of what sets the stage for us here. So Michael, the first question I do have for you is what's on the screen. The report shows that parental homeownership and wealth explain about 12 to 13% of the homeownership gap between Black and white young adults. What other factors might account for the remaining disparity?
Great question. Let me, if I can, I think that this question brings up two important points. The first one is that oftentimes wealth begets wealth. And that places, I think, this conversation into a broader historical timeline that forces us to reckon with the history of structural racism that resulted, not just in redlining, in racial covenants, but also going back further in terms of who could own property and ultimately who could participate in our country. And so all of that ultimately gets passed down over time to inform the results that we document today. The second part, I think, is more in line in response to your question, David, is thinking about some of the factors around how difficult it is to get a mortgage.
Yeah.
We know that Black families, Black mortgage applicants are more likely to be denied a loan, oftentimes because of debt to income, which speaks to the amount of debt that they often have, things like student loan debt, but also it speaks to lower incomes or the fluctuations in their employment experiences. We know that Black workers have higher unemployment rates. At the same time, I think it also speaks to rent burdens and the ability to shift from renting to home ownership and to accumulate the financial resources necessary in order to do that. The third one, I think, is around supply and the lack of affordable supply that not only can limit the homes that Black families can pursue, but also makes it difficult in that negotiation when you put in your bid and you're competing with others who may have more financial resources, perhaps even from their parents, in order to purchase a home. The fourth one, I think, is the structure of the market. Certainly, we've done a lot of work looking at the importance of real estate agents of color, of loan officers of color, of developers of color, that all can play important roles in terms of helping people of color actually achieve home ownership. But let me end with this, David, and that is, number one, I don't want to give an answer that suggests that Black families should actually do more, that they should be the ones to work harder and get more. That's certainly not the case.
Yeah.
In part because of the history and the present day instances of structural racism, which inform this, but also because there's a documented history that Black families have demonstrated a degree of resiliency that actually gets us to the point where we are today. And so that to me suggests that, yes, there are these other things. I've documented 4 or 5 others, but it really suggests that the structure in which we're operating needs to be much more expansive and malleable in order to ensure that Black families are able to enter and to be successful.
Thank you, Michael. I made some notes. Maybe if we have a little bit of time, I'll come back to some of those points that you made. My next question is for Dara. How can the wealth gap between Black and white parents be addressed to improve young Black adults' homeownership rates and economic mobility? Considering the long-term implications of disparities in wealth transfers, and especially given that the average annual cost of owning and maintaining a single-family home has increased, according to a study by Bankrate, by 26% over the past 4 years to something about $18,000.
Thanks, David. I have but one answer for this. And Michael knows what it is. It kind of, bugs me to no end how when we talk about the wealth gap, we're not understanding that the programs that we create don't actually close the gap. A lot of them, they just kind of slow the growing of the gap. And so if you've got a gap in money, there's one thing that you put in it, money. And so how do we support parents in being able to increase their wealth so that then the children can have wealth? We need to, really invest in substantial direct cash investments to parents ASAP. And the older that child is to being of home owning age, the more substantial the direct investment in the parents need to be. So that there's time for that money to mature with a shortened time for compounding.
Thank you, Dara. The report highlights that during the Great Wealth Transfer, homeowners have seen disproportionate gains. According to 2022 data from the Blackwell Data Center, the national homeownership rates are 43% for Black individuals and 71.1% for white individuals. Homeowners generally have 40 times more net worth than renters, and homeownership significantly boosts the likelihood of securing business loans, as I alluded to earlier. Business ownership is often cited as a key avenue for Black people to build wealth. Michael, how might intergenerational wealth transfers help, hinder, or exacerbate the ability to bridge the funding gap for Black entrepreneurs?
We're talking certainly about transfers that take place oftentimes, when seniors sadly, move on and die. And it's tough for me to kind of talk about it that way, but certainly when it comes to home ownership, there's an intergenerational wealth transfer around down payment assistance. And the data does seem to indicate on balance that families of color are less likely to receive that kind of intergenerational wealth transfer as well. And so, I see at least kind of four quote unquote channels almost. Number one, receiving the down payment, which in turn, can build more equity at closing, a lower loan balance. At the same time, the down payment combined with closing costs can help you to qualify for the loan. And so there's that part. Also, the degree to which it allows you to maybe buy a higher valued home, helping you to build more equity, start off at a higher place in terms of the asset that you're purchasing. And the third one is around the degree to which down payment assistance ultimately can help you to build up equity. And so all of that, I think, is critical because, David, you've mentioned that, and I think, and the evidence certainly confirms that having that housing equity, obviously there are questions around your ability to access it. And there's a lot of research to say that Black families are less able to refinance and actually access it. But the degree to which you can do that, it can be used for additional investments around a small business, around additional education, and not just for you, and but for your kids as well. And so that opens up this other conversation around, why we have home ownership. Certainly, it's for things that we want to accomplish ourselves, but ultimately, many of us want to use that home to actually enrich the lives of our children and future generations also.
Thank you for that. I have a follow-up. How might policies or programs aimed at increasing Black business ownership rates address the unequal distribution of inherited wealth, if at all?
Number one, when we think about entrepreneurship, a couple things. First, we know that entrepreneurship, is a key part, of wealth building. Now, not a lot of families, start a business, particularly a business with other employees. But it does correlate with the wealthiest of American families. But at the same time, we do also see that Black families disproportionately face challenges around business formation, most notably access to capital and access to patient capital at relatively fair pricing. And so, the ability to draw on wealth is a key way to ameliorate some of that, but also it speaks to the policies that can really focus on not just the challenges accessing specific types of small business capital, but also minimizing the contrary, which is a greater resilience on, say, things like credit card debt, higher interest rate kind of capital that often makes it difficult for someone to sustain their business. And so you're able policies that address that access to capital can both help in terms of getting them the traditional forms, but also alleviate any type of dependency on higher cost capital as well.
Thank you for that response. For the next set of questions, I want to talk a little bit about the effectiveness of existing programs. Ashon, how effective are existing programs aimed at increasing homeownership and business ownership among Black young adults?
I can definitely talk about on the homeownership side. I just want to go back, and I really like the point, Michael, that you made earlier on the earlier slide, and looking at the parental thing, if I may. And that's one of the things that it gets to when we talk about programs that are happening now. And it goes back several generations. Being able to pass down that house, and so now in our generation, you have folks that have passed down homes, whereas most of us are starting from the very beginning. And I think that in terms of programs, I think there's a lot of kind of general things that work well, purchase assistance programs, that fill that gap. There's a lot of focus on, even for those that have been able to get properties in the past, being able to properly pass those down through dealing with heirs property and title issues and clearing that up. Which is, a big issue in our communities. So I think generally the ideas, the concepts are there. It's just how are they working in the particular local market is really what it is. So, a purchase assistance program in a St. Petersburg, Florida market is going to have to work differently than, St. Louis, Missouri, because the market is different. And so, I think that's really what needs to happen is that, we need to look at not just kind of a one size fits all, a blanket program. We really have to look at, what's going to work in our particular market, which is why I get excited when folks talk about special purpose programs, and, can really get down to the very specific things that are happening in that market, because that's really what's going to move the needle going forward.
Thank you, Ashon. Dara, given that the report suggests the disparity in homeownership is likely to grow, what more needs to be done to minimize the impacts of the Great Wealth Transfer?
Michael and Ashon have mentioned a lot of the things that need to be done. And when we're talking about minimizing the impact of the Great Wealth Transfer, I interpret that as how do we expedite a Great Wealth Transfer for Black folks? And so I think there's a spectrum of things, for those who already own property. Kind of what Ashon was speaking to is we need to help protect that asset for the next generation by really investing in clearing up title so that there is something to pass on to the next generation. But also we need to start being able to build the value of the homes that we do own in the Black community. We all have seen, the tragedy of the appraisal system and its negative impacts on Black neighborhoods and Black property. It's one thing to own a property, a home. It's another thing if that home is actually underwater or it doesn't even have equity that you can tap into to fix the roof or to invest in the business or to put into somebody's college future. So we really need to retool the appraisal system so that we are able to have homes that have value and aren't based, in devaluation around race. The other thing is we have to start reshaping our tax policy so that it minimizes the benefits to those who are already wealthy and maximizes benefits to those who are still trying to build wealth. And Michael spoke, about the debt to income ratio. One of my biggest frustrations around products and programs in the so-called wealth building space is that a lot of institutions are building debt products. We really need to adopt an equity or cash or grant first approach to building wealth versus just adding yet another line of debt to somebody's balance sheet. And the last thing I would say is the best thing that we can do is give our kids a head start by investing in baby bonds. The moment a child is born, endow their future so they can mature. And by the time that they reach adulthood, they have real opportunities and assets to work with.
Thank you, Dara. I'm gonna cheat the timing a little bit, Michael, because there's something Dara said that reminded me of another Blackwell Data Center powered urban report on property condition. What role do you see that playing? Like, you know, and I can't remember if that was accounted for in your paper on intergenerational rent transfers in terms of the homes that Black people own. But maybe you could speak to either the impact that property condition might have on the expected inheritance that, you know, Black young people could eventually potentially receive.
That's such a critical question. Let me kind of let me try to approach it in three ways. The first one is, you know, to your point, we certainly find in that research report that Black homeowners were more likely to live in homes that were considered physically inadequate. And the way that we interpreted the data was that it compounded any other factors that contributed to home value gaps. And I think that speaks to this broader kind of issue around, you know, Black families less likely to get into home ownership, but when they do, oftentimes own lower valued homes. Certainly part of that is around economics. But I think as Dara is implying, part of that is around structural racism with respect to appraisals. Certainly, we've done additional research looking at automated valuation models, kind of those algorithms that produce appraised estimates of properties, where we incorporated property condition into our model and found that it did contribute to greater error. It particularly for Black communities, in part because we found that they were more that homes in majority Black communities were more likely to have properties that were considered fair or poor structurally. And so it reinforces in a lot of ways the implications ultimately for home values, and then ultimately for housing equity and wealth that one can build.
Thank you, Michael. And I want to bounce back to Dara super quick. So yesterday, as I was sort of reading through my notes for this conversation, a thought sort of came to mind around the potential impact of institutional investors on sort of either delaying or being a hindrance to us being able to get more Black young individuals into homes. Do you have any sort of perspective or insight into that in terms of the impact of sort of that trend now?
David, are you speaking about kind of these outside real estate investors buying up property, particularly in Black neighborhoods?
100%.
Yeah. It's such a deep topic that is really close to home. So maybe I'll try and answer that by very quickly just describing one of the efforts we are working through here in St. Louis. So there's a neighborhood that we've been partnered with. It's a predominantly historic Black neighborhood. And we've seen in the data, you know, over the last 20 years, but certainly around 2016, 2017 mark, you have a lot of institutional investors buying up property in that neighborhood. And what that has meant is that it has made the market so that it's nearing not being attainable for those who would typically buy in the neighborhood. And it has also put pressure on those who are already in the neighborhood, right? So we have families who have lived in this neighborhood for 3, 4, 5, even 7 generations. And what the institutional buyers are doing is they're calling local government to get their properties cited. And those citations have fees attached to them, and those citations stack up. And because the properties are devalued, they can't even tap into, there's no equity to tap into to then, you know, address the issues that the citations are calling out. And so that makes it easier for these institutional buyers to go and get the property right under, you know, a family's feet, and certainly bars entry from, you know, the young Black professional who sees a home, you know, in this community that looks like them, but now it's no longer going to be for them.
Thank you, one, for responding to something that sort of came out of left field, but I appreciate that response. The social vulnerability index is a measure of a community's ability to withstand shocks. And if you're not familiar, it's on a scale from 0 to 1. The closer to 1 you get, the more socially vulnerable a geography is. Our data shows that in southern counties where Black populations comprise about 30% or more, SVI is 0.88. Ashon, what role does climate resilience play in protecting and building wealth for Black-owned assets in vulnerable areas? And I mentioned earlier, your state happens to be one of those areas where insurance companies are essentially exiting. So what does that look like to you from your perspective?
I can tell you a very real example, just looking at this map here, not far from where I'm at in Tallahassee, in a place called Apalachicola in Port St. Joe. Just in the last few years, experienced some hurricanes that, pretty much decimated these communities. It has been very difficult for them to even rebuild. They're getting very technical. Once you get over 50% of a house destroyed, basically you have to, totally tear it down and rebuild it. And a lot of folks, they just don't have, because of the value of their property, once you take the roof off, now you're at 50% of that, just from the roof, whereas in other properties, it might be a little bit more. Of course, you just want to repair the roof, but now folks are having to, basically totally rebuild a house. And so you have now, from hurricanes 4 years ago, 5 years ago, there's just tarps on communities. And so, you have area that's been rebuilt and another area that's just neighborhood of tarps. And, that's our community. So that's kind of the stuff that we're contending with, when you talk about property values and then folks that just don't have the economic wherewithal to take care of those things on their own. And so, it takes a lot longer to rebuild. So it really does have an impact, just from the resilience. And then, of course, as we mentioned earlier, being able to get into homeownership, you might have a good interest rate, but once you, add on insurance, that could typically make you unable to afford that monthly payment because you can't get a mortgage without insurance. And so, it's really difficult. We had a couple of good years, surprisingly, during COVID, but, now with interest rates going up, it's really, really difficult with insurance costs.
And I think that maybe a week or two ago, there was a New York Times article that explored this. And even in the work that we're doing with New Orleans, where people are seeing their insurance policies go up like by 23%. And in that New York Times article that I mentioned, people were actually exiting their homes because the cost to insure it was too high. And so I feel like there's sort of this like looming potential issue that might also impact this conversation that we're having. Michael, how can data-driven approaches enhance the economic security of Black communities facing climate-related challenges?
Such a great question. I mean, it really strikes at the promise, but also the challenge. We have, there's certainly data that we can draw on, but nowhere near, I think, as robust as we would like to answer, a lot of these critical questions. We've done some research, thinking about the risk presented by climate. Specifically, we focused on what's called riverine flood risk, which is kind of the flood risk that you're living by rivers, and those rivers can flood. In contrast to coastal flooding, and in contrast to like fire and wind and other types of disaster scenarios. And one of the things that really came out was if you simply look at the expected annual loss, which really is related to the value of the quote unquote built environment, the value of the structures themselves, you find a result that says that flood risk, in this case again riverine flood risk, can be greater in white communities and in upper income white communities in particular, in large part reflecting a lot of the conversations that we've had about differences in property values. When you add in measures of vulnerability as well as measures of resiliency, thinking about, the pace of a potential recovery, that's where you really start to see the vulnerability of communities of color begin to emerge. And so it says to me, I walk away from that kind of work, remembering the importance of how people of color and how communities of color fare over the cycle, number one. But number two, it harkens again to these deeper questions of how did we get here? And what are the things that we need to change as we start to look forward? The last thing that I'll say is, hopefully, we have some analysis teed up to come up at the end of this month, thinking about homeowners insurance. And, what we find is that, again, it's lower income homeowners who are, more likely to not have homeowners insurance. Many of them don't have a mortgage. Or who pay higher. If they do, they pay higher average premiums. And these disparities are greater when they say that they believe they live in neighborhoods that are at significant climate risk. And so again, the degree to which we can bring I think that there's always a need to do more systematic analysis to find more certainty around conclusions. But the degree to which we can build evidence in an evidence case, I think that speaks to ultimately the need for policy makers as well as for private practitioners to work for change.
Thank you. I think we're at the last block of questions focused on fostering equitable data partnerships and policy initiatives for Black wealth equity. Dara and Ashon, this question is, how can partnerships between Black communities, data providers, and other stakeholders be fostered to facilitate the ethical and effective use of data for economic empowerment and healing for Black communities?
I love this question so much. So I think so much of our work clearly is dependent on understanding data, collecting new kinds of data, but also doing it in a way that is, as you said, ethical and seeks to power forward the communities that we're trying to solve for and with. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that all of us on this panel right here are products of HBCUs. And so I think when we're looking for data partnerships, a great place to look is, local institutions. And if you have an HBCU in your community, going there first, because there's just some built-in sensitivities around how to do data in an ethical way that is towards healing and is not exploitative. But, sometimes we don't have that in our backyard. And so we look for other partners. We've been really fortunate to work with Michael at the Urban Institute. And, he and the institution have a really robust set of protocols and approaches for how they work with community. And I would say just like building practices with community members from the very beginning on the kind of data that will be collected, helping them understand the data, how to yield insights from the data, and ultimately how to support them in being able to tell the stories that their data reveal. And also understanding that the data isn't just the numbers, right? The data is also our fears, our hopes, our dreams, our memories, our interactions, all of that, especially when we want data that yields healing and power, we have to pull in that quality of data as well.
Sorry, let me just jump in and say +1 to that. Sorry.
Plus 1,000. Go ahead, Ashon.
Yeah, +2. I don't know what else to really add other than, just, understanding, talking about sensitivity, for a lot of our communities. I mean, it's a constant thing. There's always someone, coming to collect some information, to do some interview, and, and it's, oftentimes it results in this resources going to the same people to do the same things, and nothing really ever changes.
Yeah.
So I think that, from the very beginning saying, we're actually trying to accomplish something. We really are listening to you, and we're not just doing this, as a perfunctory, just to get some federal grants so we can continue to go about our business. But really, wanting to have an impact and change the trajectory going forward. And some of that, might come in as Dara said, kind of having those talks and collecting different types of data, and really going deeper than we normally go, collecting that qualitative data to really understand, or talking to folks that don't often get a chance to participate in those processes. A lot of times, folks are working, so are we doing stuff at a time when they can really participate? I think those are the types of things that give cues that we're really trying to make a difference here. And of course, if you can involve HBCUs, I totally agree with that. Or those that do truly have the trust of the community, and get them involved from the very beginning, and not bring them in kind of after you've already made up your mind as to what you want to do to get a full sign. So I think those are the types of things you can do, and it's a lot of upfront work, but if you do it right up front, it can really have a big difference down the road.
Thank you for that response. Michael, what data are we still missing to more deeply understand the topic of wealth transfer?
Let me say a few things. Number one, we are certainly pushing for more data around wills and estate planning. We have that data for a certain subset of the population, but not with the degree of geographic granularity that I think we'll need, but all in a publicly available way, but also not kind of in terms of younger generations in a systematic way as well. And that speaks to, I think, Ashon, you talked a little bit earlier about Tangle Title on an heirs property. These are the types of data sets that we get to that issue. The second one for me is really kind of a deeper understanding at a regional level in terms of these kinds of inheritances and what they mean. We can certainly get that at the national level. We tried to do that in this research. But there was this question for us around what parts of the country are really kind of are really facing this relative to other parts of the country. The third thing that I will say is certainly I think stronger data around wealth more generally, but again, wealth more generally went in a way that we're able to break that down with greater regionality. Certainly, we can rely on the Survey of Consumer Finances. We can rely on the panel study of income dynamics. Those types of data certainly give us a lot of insights into wealth building. But when we start to do things, when we want to go to New Orleans, when we want to go to St. Louis, or when we want to go to St. Petersburg, that's where we start to really have to rely on, less systematic data as a way of understanding it. So, those for me are some of the key kind of opportunities that if we had that data, we could start to really more precisely inform the work that, Dara, Ashon, David, that you guys are doing specifically in your areas of the country.
Thank you, Michael. Sometimes I run the risk or have the label of being the kind of person that takes all the air out of the room, because I can only see sort of like the problems of the challenges. And so I wanted to end this conversation with sort of a hopeful view. And so this question is for all the panelists. What are some reasons for those of us who are committed to equity to feel hopeful about the future of Black wealth equity?
Number one, it's events like this. It's the courage and the willingness to raise up these issues, but also to provide potential solutions and to articulate the work that's being done to eliminate these gaps. For me, the second is the working together. There's I'm a researcher. That's kind of what I do, but I can't do the work that Dara does. I can't do the work that Ashon does. I can't do the work that Dave does. I can't do much of the work that people on the call are doing. This is the role that I have, but to be able to work with them in this kind of broader ecosystem in terms of bringing, my skills to the fore and leveraging and working with them to create change, is something that I am particularly encouraged by. The last one for me is thinking about the future generation and just hearing, I don't know ultimately what it will look like, but increase the degree to which I increasingly hear in some corners greater sensitivity, greater resolve around solving these issues so that they no longer exist. And that's not just racial equity, that's climate change, that's, all of these other issues. And those are the things that I want to be supportive as well as part of any type of legacy that I hope to be able to leave.
I totally agree with Michael. These types of events, the information and the analysis that the Wealth Data Center has, it's just phenomenal. The studies that, Michael, Neal and his team have done, when I read studies, that talk about, how to identify, mortgage-ready Black renter households, and to see, it's not that far, not that much that we really need to do if we really look at the data and kind of see, maybe folks don't need us quite as much, but if we really target it in the right area, we can be effective. And so, to have that information that we didn't have before, that we kind of knew, but to see it bear out in the numbers, and we can really have something to show a lot of people. To me, that's been very encouraging over the last few years to see all the kind of digging in, from the data side to really kind of support the work that's been done for a lot of years, that I'm not sure had as much, support behind it from a data perspective. And so I think that's really, really great. And just to be, on a panel like this with folks like Dara and you, David, and Michael, it's definitely put some air behind, my sails, every day, because, you're in the trenches, but, sometimes it's nice to be in a room like this, and it really encourages you to keep going to the next thing. So I say, that gives me hope.
I will echo what Michael and Ashon have said, knowing that people like you all are doing this work every single day is definitely a point of hope, because you're deeply committed, deeply wise, and just bring a lot to the conversation and the action. But Michael said something about, the resolve that he sees in the next generation in solving some of these issues. And hope is a wonderful thing. It is not what roots me in the work. It is not what keeps me going. For me, it really is about the resolve and the obligation. And so I encourage all of us to root ourselves in the obligation of forging ahead in this work, because in this country, wealth is not a nice to have. It is a prerequisite to fully realizing the American promise.
Thank you for that statement. An obligation. Dara, Michael, Ashon, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today and giving us strategies to empower our work. And we thank you all for being a part of this important conversation. If you're interested in staying connected with the Black Wealth Data Center and exploring more of our available data on homeownership, education, employment, and other topics related to wealth equity, please visit blackwealthdata.org. You could also scan the QR code on your screen to sign up for free access to our growing racial wealth equity database. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and until next time.